Welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and this is Indie Thoughts, the segment where we have independent developers on to talk about their studio. Today I have Peter on from Rain Games.
All right. Thank you for joining me today, Peter. I really appreciate it. And I tried my hardest to look up the right way to pronounce your last name because I didn't want to accidentally insult you. Is it Meldahl?
Meldahl is right.
Meldahl,
actually.
all right. Fantastic.
Well done.
Thank you very much. Thanks again for coming on here. Really appreciate it. I don't know if you had a chance to check out my podcast at all. Very, very small right now. But we have a lot of enthusiasm for smaller development studios like yours. And your games are really, really interesting to me. And so is your studio, actually. I made sure to read up on a ton of stuff before this.
Thanks.
You guys have elections every year to determine who's going to run the studio. Is that correct?
That is correct. Although all companies do have that in some way, sense, or form, but our company is owned by the workers, so it becomes very directly them deciding who runs it. Although, every sort of games company is usually a share company, right? Even the large ones, but not mostly it's investors or others who hold the different shares. In any such company, there is an election once a year to decide the board of the company, and the board hires the CEO of the company. Now, although we have had some changes in the board over the existence of Rain, I've always been its CEO or head, I guess. So that's stayed constant, but we do have the yearly election.
And you seem to wear a lot of hats in this company, correct? Seems
all
like
small companies.
Right. Now, a thing that I've always been curious about, in your games especially, is in Teslagrad and in World to the West, there is very obviously an overarching story that you guys are aiming at here. Now, is this something that you guys collectively came up with? Is it something that was in your mind? Because there's a lot going on. I got all the backstory in both Teslagrad and World to the West. So I was really interested in the second game to see how you fleshed out the blue-skinned people in the first game, because in Teslagrad I felt it interesting that somewhere near the tail end of the game there was a painting depicting the king sleeping in his bed, and then somebody who looked very similar to him but blue-skinned seemed to execute him in his sleep. And I thought that was just... Am I remembering this wrong?
Well, Teslagrad was a wordless game, right? So a lot of people interpret different things in a lot of ways, but I would like to know which pictures you're referring to. I say towards the end of the game, somebody executing him. I think this is probably the portrait of treason by the guards, or at least there's a planned treason there. Of course, not being able to put words in the game leaves it very open for interpretation. But in World to the West, there's a lot addressing that story in general. There's hints to it in Teslagrad again because of the interpretive nature of the game. That can be hard. Like people have had a lot of different ideas about it, but it's connected to a fruit, an apple. It makes you live forever.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. In the second game, you get all the backstory about how the person actually became blue. They found the fruit, and it seemed like you were tying with the names. It seemed like you were tying the characters into Mayan mythology, because one of the guys' names was Olmec.
Yes. No, but this is correct. There are different figures. We sort of simplify the names a little from the long versions. They are based on these different god legends, but they are in our universe. They are scientists.
Interesting. I thought that was really, really interesting because the story of Teslagrad focuses pretty singularly on the Tesla kids' journey through this area, but World to the West felt like you were really trying to flesh out a bunch of ideas that you had, and the characters are all really interesting, and it seems like the characters in World to the West, between Clonington and the Survivor Kid and the lady from Mesmer, which you actually are fleshing out in your next game,
Mm-hmm.
which I would love to hear a little bit more about that because all of your games you've taken different approaches with. The first one was more of a puzzle platformer. The second one was Link to the Past. It was action adventure, but exploration was a huge deal. I felt like the puzzles in that game was how to navigate the different people to the different areas.
Yes.
So it was interesting to me for your third game, you're doing more of a real-time strategy set in the Kingdom of Mesmer right before it goes under a revolution, correct?
Yes. Well, the genre is a little bit hard to define, I guess. Have you ever played Don't Starve?
I have not.
Have you seen any of it? Sort of any idea what it's like?
I have not.
Okay. Have you played Animal Crossing at any point?
Yes, I have played Animal Crossing.
No, it's a very different game from Don't Starve. Don't Starve is more of sort of survival game where you one of those where you get dropped into nature and you have to scrounge together some stuff and build up from there, and the environment becomes gradually harsher, and it's randomly generated and a bit of a roguelike as they kill you permanently. And Animal Crossing is of course about helping people out and making people like you essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And Mesmer is sort of a mix of the two. The city is becoming a gradually more dangerous place. So you in a way you have to prepare yourself for the upcoming struggles and the difficulties that are ahead. But instead of being in nature where you chop trees and craft stuff, you build relationships and you make alliances, and you put everything, also resources, actually, as a matter of fact, like money or weapons in place to make this stuff work out the way you want to when the revolution hits. There are different other revolutionary factions as well, and you have these important people in the city, like key holders, people who have certain control over certain resources, and getting them to your side is the part where there's a big social element of it, where you might have to betray someone to get what you need to get somebody else on your side, these kind of things. So we're calling it a social survival game.
Now, I did see that this will have multiplayer in some facet, correct? Go ahead.
Yeah, so multiplayer is challenging, but we're working very hard currently to not build any game design that excludes multiplayer. But we will have to see whether we have the resources to pull this off with multiplayer at least for an initial release, or whether we have to add it later. Or it's hard. Also, just to have the community out there to make that actually work can be hard.
I understand. Now, I was curious when I saw the multiplayer approach because I know your guys' games have a very strong story focus, which is fantastic. I love the wordless delivery in the first game, and I loved all the characterization in the second game. So I was curious when I saw that you were planning to do multiplayer, because I was curious how the story would be driven forward when the way you described it on your press release was somebody could actually oppose you in multiplayer. So,
yes.
Are you finding difficulty designing to that as you move forward?
Well, no, that is actually working out fine. The way we do it is that there's a lot going on in the city. There are many little stories and things, but we make it turn out differently every time. Not that like the things are the same, but which story snippets you end up interacting with. Have you ever played Undertale, for instance?
3 times at this point, I believe.
So you find out different things about the world in each playthrough, and different facets of different characters based on whether they are against you or with you this time. So by being able to play an experience several times, which is intended, you get to know more about everything and everyone and what's going on during these 10 particular days. So yes, through different multiple runs, you get to know more of the story than would have been convenient to tell you in a single run.
So both Teslagrad and World to the West clocked in at about 10 hours for me. Are you implying that Mesmer is going to take less time encouraging multiple playthroughs?
Yes.
Okay, very interesting. Now, if this is information you don't want to share, I completely understand. But is this set before World to the West or after World to the West?
Oh, after. We have a philosophy that we don't like the prequelitis idea of telling stories in incorrect order. This is actually something that happens to writers a lot. If you if you build a good world, then you have a good backstory for that world. You know what's happened before, right? It's the case with us as well. We try to show you. We have a very specific setup of what's happened in the universe, but we only occasionally get an opportunity to show bits of that. Instead of, I prefer to overwrite and not tell anyone than to put a lot of stuff in front for players to be annoyed at with lots of texts in games. So I'd rather keep things mystical than overexposing people to information. But mystical, but concrete. There is a specific, correct answer to everything. So, in the case of in the case of Massmer, the storytelling, of course, has been very different, but it's also intentional. It was very different from World to the West, between World to the West and Teslagrad as well. Like actually being able to write words, for instance, was very nice. And
it was go ahead.
No, yeah, it was.
It was definitely nice to see because I try to follow a good amount of your development team on Twitter, and you can really see a lot of the personality. For example, one of the first things I noticed when playing World to the West was I immediately encountered the cat, and
yes.
I go, I want to pet this cat. And it was delightful to me that at the end of the game, after I'd collected all of the different batteries, I got the ability to pet the cat. So that made me really happy. I actually responded to your artist once on Twitter that I wanted to pet the cat right when I started the game. And he kind of teased because I know there was a joke in there for Teslagrad that there was a cat mode. And there was not a cat mode. I was very disappointed. So I was glad to see that the little bits of personality that your different teammates have was able to show through so much, which I think is a benefit of having such a small development studio. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Well, definitely. And it's also sort of how we like to do things. The way we usually do it is that everybody pitches in their ideas for games and things we do. And then it's my job to sort of sort through it and see what can live together and what can't, and make like a canon. But everybody has a big impact on what goes in there. So you do see things like everyone who's working on the game has some similar influence on it and how it looks. And you're right, if you removed anyone who was on the team creating the game, then it would look different.
So do you have I don't know what the right way to phrase this is, but do you have like a long-term plan? Do you have a name for the canon you've created, first and foremost? Because Teslagrad was very focused on one specific area. World to the West expanded that area tremendously, and now we're going into some of those expanded areas. So I don't know, are you planning... Are you just seeing how long you can run this out? Or I'm really curious about the future of a story like this, because there's so many little threads that you could go off on.
Well, what we're trying to do is that we have ideas about games that we want to do in the future and storylines and things that happen in conjunction with that. So when we see the opportunity to actually make it, then we have the opportunity to sort of finish one story, but we're telling a lot of tales at the same time. I mean, it's an overarching universe, and there will be characters and connections and plots that happen over several of them. And also sort of figuring out the past, I guess, is something that people will have to do over several games if they want to get it all right. But we do try to have a singular story in every game as well. Currently, it's a lot of like many of us in the office want to do Teslagrad too, like actually do a game in that's similar to a game we made before for the first time.
So would that be another puzzle platformer, or would that be, how would you approach a Teslagrad 2? Because that's super interesting to me, because just as a quick backstory, Teslagrad was one of the games that I saw, it was highlighted by one of the PlayStation Plus sales, and there's just such an enormous amount of content out there that this really allowed me to focus in on it, and I was immediately taken with the art style and the music. The puzzle platforming was huge, and I really liked the Metroidvania way that you introduced the different exploration mechanics. And one thing that really jumped out at me was to get the actual true ending. You guys made an excellent use of the trophies because it encouraged people to get more of the backstory with the trophies, and then when you got all the trophies, you actually got the expanded full ending, which was really gratifying on a lot of levels.
Yeah, no, if we do a game with the same title, like a Teslagrad 2, for sure we will follow a lot of the tropes from the previous title. For Teslagrad, now, we haven't even touched development start on that, so it might change radically. But what I believe, at least, is the core of it, is that it has to be a Metroidvania. It has to be voiceless storytelling. It has, of course, to be that part of the universe. It has to include magnets. So a lot of these things, but we have learned a lot. It's like by the time we have any opportunity to start, it will be 6 years since we finished the last game. We've done 2 very different titles in between. So and that was our first game as well. So we are a lot more experienced as a studio now compared to what we were then. So I believe if we do make a second iteration of that, we will be able to do something very cool.
So I did have a few questions about Teslagrad since we're talking about it. When it started development, it had the name, was it Dark Rain or Rain for a long time?
Dark Rain, yes.
Dark Rain. So why did you decide to make the jump from Dark Rain to Teslagrad in terms of the name?
We were never going to call it Dark Rain. It's one of those terrible game naming tropes. Reckoning, Dark, Revolution... something.
This is that was your dolphin of sorts.
Yes. So it was because we had a style set up for a universe, and this was sort of the darkest storyline or the grimmest visuals we could imagine doing in that universe. So you see, it's very like dark tones compared to World to the West, for instance, and compared to Mesmer. If you've seen any art from that yet,
I have seen some for that. The Mesmer art was really interesting to me and was definitely something I wanted to talk to you about over the course of this conversation. But before we move past Teslagrad, I still have a few more things because who kicked off the idea for that? So did you guys come together and did you say, hey, I have an idea for this world where this kid has control over different forms of magnetism and also he's a chronomancer or what have you? Technomancer.
Yes, he's a Teslamancer.
Yes. Teslamancer, I apologize.
But this was me and Ollie. We were working on a title that we unfortunately never released, but still had we built the entire universe around this original title. It was 1 year of development, but it never did work out because we lost our programmer during that time. That title was called Minute Mayhem, and was more of a Bomberman-like title because we always do something different.
Gotcha.
But in that time where we know it was like we were a bit depressed and we knew it was failing. Actually, we were in our first office, which was just terrible. It had almost no isolation, and it was in Norway, and we had a strong Norwegian winter that year. So you can't really type well on the keyboard when you have these big gloves on, which you almost had to have indoors. So both of us had a little island of tea candles between where we sat and the keyboard to just keep our hands warm. And in that environment, we started to get all the ideas for Teslagrad. We actually still have an internal forum where we personally at least can see very clearly sort of the style and the story elements of Teslagrad being developed over time. So we have a little nostalgia park for ourselves there where we can just have a look at what it originally looked like and what it turned into.
Gotcha. That's all really interesting. So what was the... I'm curious because Teslagrad somewhat recently came to the Switch. Correct me if I'm wrong?
This is right.
Did you find that how well did that do on the Switch? And have you found that it's increased conversation about your studio or your games since it came out on the Switch?
Well, it did fairly well. I would say sales were pretty good, and this is also because you see less of these very extreme sort of cheap sales on the Switch compared to what you do on some other platforms. But in the sort of when it comes to conversation, the general conversation about the game, I believe that was strongest approximately 2 or 3 years in from release. It took a little while before people even discovered it, but when they did, it was a lot of there was a whole period. There's a speedrunning community for the game. There is a lot of interesting fan art that's been made over the years. So there's been a lot of engagement. But again, I believe that peak was, well, it's a couple of years ago now when people were the most active.
Makes sense. So after Teslagrad came out, World to the West was announced a while later, and it came out at this point a little over a year ago.
Yes.
Okay.
In May.
How have you liked how people have responded to that? Because when it was first announced, it was announced as an obvious homage to Link to the Past, and while I would agree with that, I would say that it has a much stronger emphasis on exploring than Link to the Past did, especially with the fact that your 4 different characters have very different ways of traversing the environment. So what did you think about how people responded to it?
Well, a couple of things. For one, we knew that we were going to build on some of those, base pillars of what the game would be when we started out. We always wanted to add a lot to it, just like Teslagrad is not it's very different in the sense of being a Metroidvania. We were always going to put in a lot of our own stuff. Doing the 4 characters, of course, was our way of not having an inventory. This is also a way to make sure that you actually use the entire repertoire of stuff. In Zelda, you have a tendency to latch onto, let's say, the hook shot and then never use the boomerang or any such thing. But if a couple of the interesting combinations were sort of packaged together, then it would make more sense. We just have to make each of the 4 character packs make sense as a whole, and people would use the different parts. So now, when it comes to reception, World to the West released in a very different climate from Teslagrad. Teslagrad was released just in a period where Steam was beginning to become a little oversaturated. We were, if you remember Greenlight, and at the very moment Steam gave up on Greenlight and just greenlit 100 titles at the same time,
right?
We were on that list.
Ooh.
We were actually on the top of the rankings for the list before, but they skipped us for some reason. And instead, we ended up in the bottom of that press release because we were sorted alphabetically. So we were in the T for Teslagrad. So the press, but still, as that might not have been an ideal launch, this was still in a period before Steam became truly oversaturated. So when we came so far as the launch of World to the West, managing to get the attention of the PC gaming audience just by being a new release on that particular platform is very, very, very hard. So it took a while, and it's taken a while. Like the console releases had to come out, and people had to see it there, and then some started purchasing on the PC. But it has been that's been harder to bring an audience to World to the West than it was to Teslagrad, for sure.
That's interesting.
Those are well reviewed, though.
Yes, I know. I enjoyed it tremendously. I made sure 100% to play through it the entire way before we had this conversation because I wanted to speak to the different facets of it. For example, one thing that I thought was really interesting, I really liked the battery idea. Like, I thought that was really unique. So, but on top of that, one thing that I thought was interesting was the fact that over half of the game takes place in the last chapter. What drove that decision for you, for the studio?
Well, a couple of things. So this actually grew a little bit out of testing over time. We knew that we wanted to open up the entire world to the player to explore at some point. And actually make them choose which things they did from there on. Like, there are 3 major objectives in the last part of the game, and you can solve them somewhat in the order you like. But the first part of the game had to be structured, and we had to give it some feeling of structure. Because we found that if we try to give people that freedom early on, they would just get lost. So what we ended up doing was just having this narratively structured first half of the game where you became familiar with parts of the world map and character movements that did these things, and opening things up afterwards. And we've also seen that people react very differently to that. Some people prefer the structured first half of the game quite strongly because they don't feel lost, and progression, it feels like you're progressing solidly towards something. Whereas others prefer the second half because they can do whatever they want. They can do these wacky things or find these crazy places in the outskirts of the map and all these things. So
yeah, I know I was surprised when I was churning through the first. There's 9 chapters in the game. Is it 9 or 10?
I believe it's 10, yes. I don't remember right now.
So I was churning through the first chapters like nobody's business, and I got to the last chapter, and suddenly it goes, go to these 3 different parts of the map. What? And I spent much more time doing that, but it was really engaging to me, the fact that I went, okay, well, Clonington can climb up right here, but the survivor can't go this way. So I have to go around the entirely different part of the map, and then you have the Teslamancer, who has an entirely different set of skills. Like, I really liked how you described it as using different characters so you didn't have an inventory. Did you find a lot of, slightly off topic though, did you find people came to your studio with questions about some of the plot lines? One thing that jumped out at me was, we seem to accept that Clonington is a clone, but we don't really touch on that at all. Like, oh, it'll be difficult to make another clone, and that's it. So I had a lot of questions.
We write a lot of universe, and we don't tell you everything. But you did notice that he was rather foolhardy, right?
Oh yes. So
he might get himself killed. Yes.
I was guessing that wasn't the first time that he'd gotten himself killed. So that was something that really jumped out at me. That was something I really wanted to know more about. And I was curious because at the end of the game, when he's on the boat and the Teslamancer gets back on the boat, presumably to go home, well, Clonington's going home, I assume.
Yes.
I wondered if we would get more explanation about it in the next game, but instead you have decided to go the Mesmer route.
Ooh.
So,
well, Clonington is a world-traveling adventurer, so he might show up other places as well.
That is something do you think, and again, you don't have to share this, do you think we'll see Tesla Kid again, who is now Tesla Man?
Yes, very probably. Like, we knew very definitely we hadn't named him in the first game, and the second game had speech, and then we knew he was going to be addressed as a character right in the beginning of the game, and then we have it be his daughter who says it, and we just have her say Dad instead of giving a proper name again.
Right. I thought that was pretty clever.
So yes, of course, if we do a Teslagrad 2, he will definitely be referred to, but I don't think he'll be the main character though.
I'm really
you would like to play him again?
Well, I would like to know, like, this is the kind of thing where I feel like he's going to end up being super important to some plot point later, but much like other games that come out that don't use the same main character, I don't know if he's going to end up being a good guy or a bad guy, because in World to the West, there's an implication that the Teslamancers weren't necessarily enjoyed in the areas they went. There's not an implication, actually. The one boss you fight explicitly talks about how the Teslamancers ruined her life, which we haven't touched on at all so far.
She actually it's possible to eke out that story. Okay. Her mother was one of the king's followers. So the player very directly ruined her life.
Oh. Okay.
If you played the last game.
I can't say I got that connection. In fact,
no. We are aware that we are being vague about that. Although her costume is a red one with a crown on top of its helmet, so we do have a couple of hints.
I really like how all these things tie together. And so let's see. I'm trying to think if there was anything else about World to the West that I wanted to ask about. Um, what what was uh, there was the weather machine. That was kind of the final boss of sorts. Do you think there's going to be a lot more discussion about that ancient technology that was created in the games moving forward? Does Mesmer, like, did the ancient technology, was that prolific over the entire world, or was that just in the World to the West area?
Well, no, it was there was an ancient empire in Europe as well, but it
Mm-hmm.
is better known by these nations. It's less mysterious.
Right.
But the Tesla monsters, like if you look at Teslagrad,
Mm-hmm.
you can see drawings of these places in World to the West on some murals and places, and you can even see if you look at the achievement cards, you can see that certain items in that game have been brought from World to the West area into the Teslagrad area. So some of that ancient tech is from there, and
Mm-hmm.
there are some other items as well. Like the King's Crown is an ancient relic, like the weather machine. And if you look at how he uses it during the boss fight and how it works, you
Mm-hmm.
can sort of imagine which sort of force of nature it plays with.
Yeah, that was just as a quick side note. I know we've moved past Tesla Grad at that point. That final boss was not easy for me. I don't know if it was easy for most people, but I had a tough time with that.
We call the crown the infinite cog.
All right. Hmm. Interesting. Sorry, not the time to be speculating, but that is really interesting. Um, so now I'd like to move on, and you first off, the congratulations on getting the grant money from the Norwegian Film Associate. Wait,
Yes.
did I get it right?
Yeah, the Film Institute.
Film Institute. Okay. So congratulations on that. I'm glad to see that you guys, the work is getting recognized and you don't have to worry so much about managing your sales and merchandise so you can focus on Mesmer. Um, how is, when you're developing a game like this or any game, how do you structure? Because I have a background in project management myself. What kind of milestones do you guys set in order to make sure you're going to hit X release date?
Oh, it depends on what we're building. You must understand that, for instance, Mesmer that we're building now is very different in nature.
Mm-hmm.
For the two first ones, we have pre-production, and then we build a different area. So we're not necessarily the argument, but we make sure that the different bosses, different areas are on time. The thing about Mesmer is it's much more systems driven. So that means that everything starts to sort of work at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The city has existed for half a year already, but we're making it so that all the systems actually interconnect and work. So now it's more about making everything enjoyable for people who are not us.
Gotcha.
It's a sort of, it's very different to work on, honestly. So now what we try to do is to have different goals of like game-wide systems operating or working together, and making it more comprehensive. In very large degree, Mesmer as well is a game that no one has played before. It's not like anything you've ever seen before.
Mm-hmm.
So we also have to explore a lot. In the cases where you have some games in mind when you make a title, you can sort of avoid any pitfalls that they have already either stepped in or sidestepped.
Mm-hmm.
They have solved a lot of problems, essentially. If you make
Got
any platform, there is sort of a lot of platformer wisdom that comes along with that. But if you're just going out into the wilderness, then you have to cut the path yourself. So that makes for a more novel game, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also more challenging when it comes to knowing what technical challenges there will be and what challenges in making interesting gameplay there will be. So this is much more explorative. It has to be. So it's harder to plan a hard path from the beginning because you might encounter rivers and valleys on the way.
I gotcha. Interesting. That's very, very interesting. Now, this is a question only because you're he is your artist, Ali, right?
Yes, now we have 3 artists.
Okay.
He does the character designs, he does a lot of he does the final lighting and stuff. So if you want to split them up, he does that kind of stuff. Then you have Aslak, who animated, who did all the 3D characters and animated all of them that were in World to the West. That's done by one man.
Wow.
And Petter does everything else, everything you don't notice, like the ground, the grass, the trees, the walls. Yeah.
All right. Interesting. The question that I was going to posit, though, was because at one point there is a big push over the last few years to have soundtracks made physically available. Have you guys considered doing something like that for either Teslagrad or World to the West? Because World to the West had some of the catchiest ditties that I've heard in a while. So I was curious. The reason I brought it up was because Ali had mentioned releasing a vinyl soundtrack for World to the West.
Yeah, he will mention that. I don't believe we will do a vinyl.
Okay.
There exists a small set of for both Teslagrad. In Teslagrad, there exists some hard to get now, but versions of that soundtrack that were part of the indie. Do you know about the indie the box people?
Oh, the indie box, yes.
Teslagrad was the very first indie box ever.
Wow.
And it was printed, believe they made 300 copies. And we ordered like 30 of them ourselves. And they do contain the soundtrack. Like, we have done a lot of physicals over the year. This was our first physical, and it's by far the smallest volume. That was also the only one that contained the soundtrack. So good luck finding it, but that does exist. There does also exist a small number of World to the West soundtracks, and we do have a couple in the office.
Okay. I'll see what I can find over the Googles.
Yes. I actually don't quite know where they were sold, but presumably they were sold somewhere, because we do have a couple. Or we could perhaps send you one.
Okay, well, that would be appreciated, but if they're a hot commodity, I'm not going to impose on you by any stretch of the imagination. The reason I ask about the vinyl or the soundtrack in particular is I really like supporting smaller studios like yourself, and I feel like the vinyls are a great example of that because it showcases both the hard work you guys put in on the soundtrack and the hard work that's put in on the art, because usually the fold out of the vinyl, assuming it's a multi-disc thing, really gets a chance to showcase sometimes it's test art, sometimes it's special art. It's something that's really special that's put in for the work, and I can tell from both Teslagrad and World to the West that your artists have a lot of passion for what they do.
Oh, yes.
So, but I also know there's a logistical nightmare with vinyl. So
yes. Well, the easiest way to get the soundtracks, if you're not going to go into obscure physical editions, they are available on Steam.
Oh, okay.
So that's a relatively easy way to get a hold of them. And if you own the games, you even get a rebate on them, I believe.
Hey, well, I own all the games on PlayStation.
That doesn't help.
It does not help. But hey, I mean, I'm looking to support you guys more, right? So.
And unknown to many people, Steam is actually a music player itself.
Oh, I personally was not aware of that, but my producer might be more aware. He's a big Steam guy, so.
So if you purchase any, if they're correctly made, what ours are, if you purchase them on Steam, you're able to play them in the Steam client. You don't have to think about fiddling around with other stuff there. You can just put them on.
All right. Duly noted. So let's see. I'm sure I have more, but I want to make sure to structure this in a good, coherent way. What do you think that your studio will continue at the size it currently is? Do you think that's a good agile size, or do you think there's a chance? Because, for example, I'm sure you've heard of the games like Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, correct? By Supergiant? Yes. They recently added about 50% to their workforce, but I question, because I'm a huge fan of independent studios, I question at what point does it become difficult to remaneuver your studio based on size. So I'm curious. Go ahead.
there are different plans that people have for this. So in our case, well, we would have to make a game that turned a larger profit in order to earn to increase the team size for sure. So that's the first requirement. But for practical reasons, I would love to see Rain Studios become larger, but not actually have the games teams be any larger. But instead having multiples of them. Currently, we use approximately 3 years to make a title. And that is cool, but we don't release it in a universe. But we have a lot of extra things we want to do with this universe, and we would love to be able to have a more routine schedule. So instead of having one group focusing on a game, now we have 10 people total, but not everybody works in a game, right? You have other people doing boring stuff as well. And then you have... Yeah, but they also have we have external sound at the moment. Actually, Martin Kvala picked up a lot of awards over that for the years. He does the sound of half the Norwegian games industry, I believe. But
Gotcha.
But we would love to have internal sound, but that wouldn't be feasible if we do only one game. If we did 3 games, we could just have that ourselves. Stuff like doing accounting and these things does not actually become a lot harder if you have multiples, so that you retain that size of the staff, and then you instead have a bunch of blocks, 3 blocks of people with different leadership, like one person responsible for each, just small enough that they don't need middle management.
Right.
So then you have those running tandem, preferably so that each one of them is in a different stage. If they have 3 years productions, then you're able to release a game every year.
Okay.
That would be ideal, in my opinion, for the sort of thing we're doing, and I don't think you're going to break any backs in the sort of making a too hard to maneuver structure by doing so.
And that would also be interesting. Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's only we have to keep our stories straight. But this is done correctly by much larger and more complicated stuff. I mean, imagine keeping one of those comic book universes running, for instance.
I imagine that about every 6 weeks they go into a big room and say, who has an idea, and then they slap them if it's wrong. So that was actually the point I was going to ask, though, is that do you think there would be complication? As we've said before, you have a very comprehensive idea of where this world is going. Do you think it'd be difficult if you had multiple games in production, the quality check, I suppose, to make sure that everything continues to line up? Because with your one team, it would be easy. I would imagine it's easier to make sure there's not any kind of canonical plot holes. But if you have 3 different teams, there would have to be some sort of oversight, correct?
I think my answer is no, so long as I am not responsible directly for one of the 3 teams. I could definitely, but currently I have, as you say, a lot of hats. If you take off one major hat, which is being responsible for the direct development, production, and everybody's happiness in the 10-man team, it's much easier to keep an eye on 3 teams than it is to run one directly. That does, however, mean that I would need 3 more excellent team leads and a ton of money. So, that might not happen as planned.
Well, I mean, if you continue putting out the same quality work you've been putting out, it seemed to be getting good reception. So I'm just waiting. Mesmer's gonna blow you guys up. I'm positive.
Let's hope. It's getting harder and harder to sort of have reach with the indie game community. I know a lot of my colleagues are sort of spouting doom and gloom for how things have changed, how hard it is now to be noticed at all. But we have managed to stay head above the water so far, and hopefully we will manage to do so in the future. And if we have a proper hit with Mesmer, in the sense that we bring back way more than we had to put in, then for sure. Our goal is not to make a ton of profit. That we wouldn't have been doing this in the first place, to put it like that. But I would love to be able to do a little bit more. We have so much more that we want to do.
So I have a question based on something you just said. You'd mentioned that there's a little bit of doom and gloom in the independent community right now.
Oh, yes.
Do you think that's because that there's just an oversaturation of independent games? Do you think there are quote unquote too many good games, or there's just too many games, or what is driving this rain cloud?
Well, I think everybody has their own ideas about that, but I feel there is something that happens, right? People should be a little bit aware of, and that is if you have a market that has like you used to have gatekeepers, and that used to be a real problem because they essentially only let very large companies in. And then you had a shift. Steam, for instance, became a lot more available for independents and these things, and Greenlight happened. But over time there, Steam has changed and other platforms have changed as well. Mobile has always been like that, I guess, where the gates are just completely open to absolutely everything and everyone. And there's a lot going on in there. Like if the customer can't pick up anything and having faith that it will be good, then they only they become wary and they flock to things they know. It's like okay, imagine a universe like if you have ever seen like what it was like in the Super Nintendo era. You could go into a video game store, you had all these boxes, and you knew that each one of these games is a proper game. It's going to be worth playing. But doing that on the Steam store is just not true.
Right.
And because you knew each one of them was worth playing, you might pick up the Mario game first, but then you could pick whatever. If it had a cover that was interesting, it was in your genre, these things. But when you have to be really buyer beware, then you go for the known article. So what happens is that if the gatekeepers are too strict, then only the giants exist, right? Then as they become less strict, it becomes more varied. But then when they come under a certain threshold, then everybody can play. Even less serious actors, let's say, then you get a situation where the only thing that then you get sort of an ocean level of insecurity rising up, and the only people standing up on an island are people who have a direct marketing budget. In the games industry world, that mostly means the AAA industry. That means that your brand name is already recognized, or either you take a big IP or you say, oh, Batman. They're going to play this because it's Batman. It's our seal of approval, right? Or you're going to play this because you played the last 14 Madden games. So this is the 15th Madden game. You know what it is. So that is, I believe that having no gatekeepers at all. For instance, right, Steam said now, let's have no system at all. Let's just make people pay $100. And then I heard people saying, oh, but what about those indies who can't pay $100? And listen, if you're spending years and years making a game, and you can't just get through the door because you can't find $100, there's something very strange going on. That's a very unusual Cinderella story right there.
Yeah, that's $100. That's you can go scrounging for change and find that before super long. So
yes. And Steam actually refunds it as well. You get it back if you earn enough to get it back. So out of their share of what you get, yes.
I was on
but I believe it could have benefited by being way higher. Because if you say currently you're betting that because they only take 30%, right? That means that if you earn approximately $300, you got all your $100 back. So you're making a bet with $100 saying, my game can sell for at least $300. That is a pretty weak bet.
Sorry, go ahead.
So if you put that up a little bit, then people wouldn't seriously submit games they didn't think could make a certain amount of money. I can tell you, right, you shouldn't aim for our sizes. You should aim for, like, what does a single self-employed part-time interesting indie developer need to make? And yeah, he needs to make a little bit more than $300 as well. He needs to make a little bit more than $3,000 too.
That's true.
So if you look at that and you consider sort of where the bar should be, I'm uncertain, but that has something to do with it. Now we're looking at the Switch. The Switch has also been beautiful for independent developers so far. And they did that by limiting dev kit availability essentially, but they're not actually limiting people very much when it comes to entering the console now, and development kits are becoming more available. So, and of course, the fear returns that the same thing will happen.
The gatekeeper thing jumped out at me a lot because I remember approximately 7 years ago I got into PC gaming because there was a huge boom of interesting independent titles, as you were mentioning before. But I'm not much of a PC gamer. I've been playing Nintendo, Sega since I was a small child. Then both Nintendo and especially Sony got on the independent kick. That's actually where I ended up playing Teslagrad, was through Sony. Do you think that the consoles are serving both Sony, maybe Xbox, and definitely Switch? Do you think they're effectively being gatekeepers? I know you said Switch is kind of opening it up a little too much, but do you think Sony did a good thing by bringing more independent titles? I know they had Hotline Miami, Birth of Isaac, Teslagrad, lots of small studios on there.
Let's be clear. Anything that you would recognize as an independent developer should definitely be on there. But anything that we would recognize as an asset flip should probably not be on there. If you know what those are?
Yes, so those are the quick cash-in games you see on Steam where they reskin something so that way they can sell it for a small amount, basically.
Yeah, this is particularly kind of part of this industry who considers, tries to find interesting ways to earn money by doing as little work as possible, meaning they don't have to earn a lot of money, but they make some terrible tripe. This is what we want to avoid, along with any sort of entries by people who are, let's say, very unprepared to use a games engine at all.
Gotcha. Okay, I won't get too much into that. I do think it's interesting though that do you find, for example, like this, do you find engaging with your fans has helped build brand loyalty?
Oh, yes, definitely. Of course, we do try to keep in touch with people. We are on Twitter. We are pretty active, as you mentioned. It's probably the best channel, but we're also on Facebook and doing other things. In general, of course, we are on a lot of different conventions. We will be at Gamescom soon enough. So if people are coming to Germany, Köln, Gamescom, largest gathering of gamers in the world, then come see us there.
Gamescom is one of the conventions that I would really love to go, but wouldn't you know it, I'm not in Germany that week. Who would have guessed it?
Yeah, no, it is. It's quite a trip, especially if you're outside the European area, of course. But then again, a lot of the other big ones are in the US, which is far for the Europeans as well. So there's usually one big convention in every area, though. Or if people want to take the trip all the way up to Norway, you can always visit our studio here as well.
All right, that's a plug if I've ever heard one. So, all right. Well, I think that we are about good. Is there anything else you would like to add? Or this has been a delight having you on.
Oh, yes, it's been great. To anyone who might fear I'm being negative of smaller titles in my previous statements, that's not what we're talking about.
Oh, no, absolutely.
If somebody has an indie game studio, that's not what we're talking about either.
No. All right. Well, thank you again for coming on, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
All right. Have a good day.
Well, have a good day.
Have you played Teslagrad? Have you played World to the West? Are you looking forward to Mesmer? Let us know. But until next time, this has been Indie Thoughts on Co-Opinions.